Have I mentioned really it's been a lousy week? Have I mentioned that recently? Yeah, I thought so. What happens when there's no simcha in Simchat Torah? Never in 2,500 years, since the Israelites became the first religious community on earth to canonize and embrace and adopt their own sacred book to make it the center of life, never until 2 years ago has there been a Simchat Torah that was sullied. What happens when there's no simcha in Simchat Torah? Should have been a great week. We kicked off Sunday with a family brunch. Our 2 resident kids decided not only to bring over the grandchildren, but to challenge their mother to the Great British Bake Off on who can make Carol's famous Rosh Hashanah apple cake better. So we had a 3-way tasting, at the end of which the question was, who gets the Paul Hollywood handshake? And each of them spontaneously reached across the table to grab the 2 hands of the person across from them. Should have been great. Not to mention that our 3-year-old grandson is enough of a little mensch that he makes a very important big boy game of picking up all the toys he scattered around the living room floor earlier on in the day. That should have been great. Monday, tail end of Sukkot, of which Deuteronomy 16 says, V'samachta b'chagecha v'ha'ita ach sameach, being particularly joyous. Tuesday, Shmini Atzeret. I got to go to shul. Somebody else had to run the service. I loved it. And they gave me the 4th Aliyah, which is a problem. Go ahead, ask me why. Because I'd written the check during Chol HaMoed for having gotten the 4th Aliyah on the first day of Yontif, and I hadn't mailed it yet. So now I had to pull it out of the mail, double the check, and send it back for 2 scoops of wonderfulness. That should have been great. Sunday with apple cake. Monday, V'ha'itach Sameach. Tuesday, Shmini Atzeret, Yisker. But instead of being sweetened and enhanced, the whole week was embittered and diminished right up front by the Monday release of the Chatufim, the last 20 living Israeli hostages, home in the Jewish state just in time for the 2nd anniversary of their kidnapping on Simchat Torah. What should have been, and for those who don't understand the nuances, probably was a jubilant shehechianu moment, left those of us in the Jewish community, in leadership, in membership, Zionists and not, left us numb, bitter. This ceasefire is not a peace. Alerts of rocket attacks against Israel continue from other regional actors, and Hamas has neither disarmed nor disavowed any future action against Israel. To the contrary, entrenched and encouraged. Having secured this ceasefire constitutes a de facto diplomatic validation of Hamas, consolidating and deepening their role and their power politically. That political power is being split and contested amongst warring clans and gangs, since Israel's systematic elimination of the leadership of Hamas over the last 2 years has turned this fascist death cult into a headless snake with no leadership and no accountability. Those Hamas operatives who no longer have to guard 20 captives from Israel formed vigilante gangs on Monday. Freed from guard duty, now they could be punitive, roaming the entire Gaza Strip to hunt down and kill Palestinians who had in recent months been protesting their organization, saying Hamas doesn't speak for me. 300 Palestinian dissidents were executed on Monday, with pickup trucks shuttling around the streets of Gaza, piling off displays of dead bodies as trophies, the same way that corpses of murdered Israelis and music festival participants raped to death had been driven around on October 7th, 2 years ago. With the last live hostages now returned to Israel, the dead hostages are in some cases being intentionally withheld, contrary to the ceasefire agreement, as Hamas bargaining chips, while other unidentifiable remains will for the indeterminate future remain buried under the rubble of Gaza battlefields. The Torah tells us that the children and grandchildren of our patriarch Jacob brought his body home to Israel once the 40 days of his mummification in Egypt were concluded. The families of the dead hostages in Gaza, after waiting 2 years for some word of their fate, might at this point welcome that kind of timetable, because the bones of Jacob's son Joseph were not carried home to the promised land for nearly 500 years after his death. As for the 20 living hostages that we should be so proud and pleased and happy to have back, our jubilation at their homecoming was perforce, bitter, and subdued. Previous returnees from Hamas captivity, this is after all the remaining 20, previous returnees have reported on the harrowing ordeal of being kidnapped and held. But only the final 20 who came home this week have experienced fully and can fully describe the nightmare existence of having been plunged themselves into the entirety of the nightmare in Gaza, literally shut away from the sun for 2 full years. For them, the trauma did not go away on Monday. The culture shock of coming home so summarily from, as our prayer book and as our prayer for the hostages puts it, me'afela le'ora, from deepest darkness into light, from enforced starvation into bountiful plenty, from captivity to freedom, has, and ask the Rebbitzin next time you see her, Carol will concur, both immediate and potentially long-term psychological impact. Not to mention doing lasting physiological harm. In the spring of 1945, good-hearted American troops inadvertently killed some emaciated concentration camp inmates by handing them K-rations. In the week before this past Monday, malicious Hamas operatives intentionally all but killed some of the emaciated Israeli hostages by force feeding them to make them look healthier for the news cameras on Monday. There is one additional component of painful reserve that has embittered, at least for me, the sweetness of the hostages' homecoming, and certainly for them. We are all familiar with the traditional Jewish cycles of grieving, marking progressive stages of bereavement during the first week following the burial, the Shloshim month for the rest of the month after the death, and throughout the remaining 11 months of Avelut until the first yahrzeit. The reality is that throughout human history, transportation, communication was always such that it might be that somebody living in point A did not learn the death of a dear one at point B until long after it occurred. And so perforce our tradition addresses the question of what rules of grieving apply in a case like that. In addressing the situation, rabbinic literature uses the term shmu'ah. Do you hear the word shema hiding in there? Shmu'ah rechoka, hearing from a distance, not just a geographical distance, but a chronological one. Upon hearing long afterward, being informed of a loss long after the fact, a bereaved person is traditionally exempt from the formal structure of grieving. They don't have to observe a year of Avelut because the year since the death happened long since. But the reality is, in human terms, they're going to be bereaved nonetheless. And so the tradition is for Shmu'ah Rechoka, getting the belated news of the death. You cut Kriya and may observe as much of Shiva until Shabbat arrives, when you join the community and say Kaddish. Of the 20 people who came home to Israel on Monday, this week was the first time in 2 years they were able to learn the fate of their friends and loved ones, having clung in their darkness to the hope that those who matter to them escaped the bloodbath of October 7th. Some of them were shattered this week to learn that their friends and families and partners and neighbors were among the 1,195 victims. The principle of Shmuar al-Chokah, hearing from a distance, established it would be unreasonable to impose upon these stunned survivors on Monday the grim year of formal mourning, a full 2 years after the loss. But at the same time, Jewish law recognizes their fundamental need to undertake a brief period of bereavement upon hearing the belated news of their loved ones' deaths. As such, the entire population of Israel is aligned this week and on this Shabbat with the newly released hostages, not just to embrace them and welcome their return, but also to condole them on the many losses with which they are just now coming to terms during this long-delayed week of Shiva. We Jews of the far-flung diaspora also align on this Shabbat with these wounded souls who've returned home as what the Bible compassionately describes as ud mutzal me'esh, a brand plucked out of the fire. It is to offer encouragement to these people who have undergone mayhem and pain that we highlight the description of primordial chaos in the opening words of Genesis we just read, tohu vavohu, as but a point of departure for the creation which follows. It is to offer encouragement to these people who languished in hunger and thirst, that we share the nourishing words of Torah, which our sages of antiquity compared to the nourishment of water, wine, honey, and milk. It is to offer encouragement to these people who grieve in spite of their joyous homecoming, that we tonight temper our jubilant Simchat Torah with the bittersweet poignancy of Yizkor. I invite all worshipers here to take out the memorial booklets you got on the way in, and let us rise together for a moment of personal devotion dedicated not just to the sweet remembrance of our own loved ones taken from us long ago in years past, but on this Shabbat, in affirmative support of those living hostages who are spending the sweetness of this Shabbat, coming to terms with the bitter news just learned of those ripped from them 2 years ago. יזכרו נשמת רבות אלפי ישראל שנהרגו, שנשרפו, שנטבעו, שהורעלו, שנחנקו על קידוש השם. בעבור שנתנו צדקה בעדם, בשכר זה תהיינה נשותיהם צרורות בצרור החיים, עם נשמות אברהם ושרה, יצחק ורבקה, יעקב, רחל ולאה, ועם שאר הצדיקים וצדקניות שבגן עדן, ונאמר, Amen. Let us turn to page 4 and cantor if you'd honor us, please.
El Malerachamim Shochein Bamromim Ametzeh Menucha Nechona Tachar Kanfei Hashvinah במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמת שבלי נדר ניתן צדקה בעד הזכרת נשמותיהם בגן עדן תהיינה מנוחתם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם ונאמר Amen.
We read together, O God, full of compassion, dwelling on high, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to the radiant souls of our dear ones who have departed this vale of illusion and embarked upon eternity. Merciful One, as we have pledged tzedakah in their memory, let them find refuge forever in the shadow of your presence, and let their souls be bound up in the bonds of life everlasting. Eternal One, who is their inheritance, may the repose be for peace, and let us say,